This season, a new hot deal has arrived at Metro. $25 a line for 4 lines with all the data you need and 4 free Samsung Galaxy A15 5G phones. Getting Metro's best deals is easy. No ID required, no activation fees. Get a new number or keep your own. It's up to you. That's 4 lines for $25 a line, plus 4 free phones. Visit a store or go online today. Only at Metro by T-Mobile.
When you join Metro Plus Tax. For a limited time and subject to change. Max 1 offer per account.
Hello again, listeners. We're here to slake your unholy interview thirst for a second time in this foul season, this disgusting pre-autumn quagmire that calendar scientists call summer. This time, we're talking to horror filmmaker Brandon Cronenberg, the writer and director of the wonderfully disturbed films Antiviral, Possessor, and Infinity Pool. Now, a note, this is not a spoiler-free discussion, so if that's something you care about, consider watching the movies before you dive into this interview. Once again, these interviews would not be possible without the support of our patrons on Patreon, so thank you. And if you enjoy our work, consider signing up. You'll get access to the ad-free RSS, bonus stories, behind-the-scenes discussions for every episode, and other such tangibles. But now, without further ado, here's Brandon Cronenberg.
Hello, I'm Jacob Duarte Spiel.
And I'm Alexander Saxton.
And we've caught a live one today in our cursed audio trap, our interview snare. He's the writer and director of 3 of the best and most original horror films of the 21st century, Antiviral, Possessor, and most recently Infinity Pool. That's right, it's Brandon Cronenberg. Brandon, how are you?
I'm good, although that introduction was way more sinister than I was. I didn't realize I had been snared. I'm now super concerned, but maybe...
You're snared, you're caught, you're trapped.
It's a
You
live
only
trap.
exist within the frame of this Zoom call.
Will I ever get out? I don't know.
Yeah.
Alexander, you were talking about bed bugs earlier. Do you want to bring that up?
We had him. Maybe we got him. I don't know. Everything. My apartment is destroyed. My life is in shambles. I'm going to walk into the lake after this interview. And even in death, I will never be clean.
Amazing.
End of preamble. That's what I got.
I am doing fine. Anyway, so Brandon, I wanted to start with a question about your movies, about horror craft, and the way different artists approach horror. Your films they basically contain no jump scares or anything even similar to a jump scare, and instead I find myself overcome with a feeling of dread that builds for almost the entire duration of the film. That's a compliment. Is there a creative philosophy around how you approach that, how you approach the craft of horror, how you approach the craft of making something scary?
It's not necessarily a conscious thing. I mean, to a certain extent, I think there are kind of 2 ways to approach art or certainly film. One is you're trying to make the most money possible, so you make a film that you think people will pay for, and the prevalence of jump scares in horror comes from that. There's a sort of direct parallel between more jump scares and more money, because people like that, and that gets your heart rate up. You feel like you've had this terrifying experience, and so I think a lot of commercial horror has found that jump scares are really the way to take money from children, essentially. I'm not trying to be condescending if people like jump scares. The other way is to try to make a film that you yourself feel you might appreciate as an audience member, and to kind of approach it more from an art perspective first. It's always a bit funny with film because it's such you have to engage with the industry side of it. It's not like a novel where you can just write it and have no financing going into it. You still need to care about commerce, but you can take a kind of more personal artistic approach, I guess. Whatever. Yeah, I guess the slow dread kind of horror is something that I appreciate as an audience member, and I drink too much coffee to really enjoy jump scares.
Yeah,
can I immediately derail us and ask a follow-up about how you actually do that, how you actually find people on the commercial side of things that you can work with, who will respect the vision, how you build those relationships, how you find them?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in my case, it's sort of trial and error. I recently had someone describe working with new producers as a blind date, and I thought that was sort of apt. You go in with someone you've never worked with before, and you're incredibly vulnerable because they really have a lot of control over and influence over the outcome of your film. They can do huge damage to your work, or they can really support it, and you begin going in blind, and then you develop relationships. And if you find people you trust, and it's the same with crew, it's the same with cast, you find people you trust, you really cling to them, because it doesn't matter what people say in film. People will say all the best things. It really comes down to actions, and then developing those relationships in a kind of pragmatic way. So I found, for instance, I have producers who I know well in Canada, who I work with, who I'm close to and have these histories with. So I feel like I've got the Canadian producer thing locked down, pretty well. Neon put out my past two films in the US, and they've been hugely supportive and great. And they're one of those companies that really has, along with A24 and a few other distributors, cracked a certain code. I think they're fulfilling a very important need in the film world right now, which is releasing films that are unconventional but have commercial value. They're
like the mid-level, like independent or mid-level film that no longer really gets made because a lot of those production companies and distributors don't exist anymore, or have been swallowed up by Disney, Discovery, whoever.
Yeah, but it's interesting because people say that they don't get made, and that sort of is true. The people aren't making 8.5 anymore, and like you're not like you're not getting free reign on a $50 million film to do some sort of crazy art film. But the companies like the ones I've mentioned are supporting. They're not micro budget films. They're supporting pretty artistic films, pretty interesting films, especially in the genre space. And so it's actually, you can get into a miserable mindset and say, oh, it's just superhero films and sequels, and that's it. And the film industry is a burning ship, but it isn't really. There's some amazing stuff that's going on in genre in particular.
No, that's true, and I don't mean to make it. I don't mean to make it sound like those things aren't getting made. It's more that I guess the distribution model looks different, and maybe they don't get as long of a theater run, so they show up in other places. But it's the marketplace. The big players have gotten larger, and the medium-sized players have stayed the same size. So it feels like there's a domination, but in reality, it's exactly like you said. Those things are still getting made.
Yeah, but that is true. You don't have a huge theatrical run if you're doing a sort of weirdo indie thing.
I was going to say, so you haven't signed up to do one of Mattel's 54 films that they've got coming out in the next half decade?
They just haven't called me yet. I'm waiting.
You're ready to sell out.
I'm waiting for the Mattel Cinematic Universe.
The first opportunity to just make a tiny bit of money and just retire.
So eager to sell out.
On the subject of visual style, as you were talking about before, about I think what's really interesting is you sort of encapsulated, also, not to make this interview about ourselves, but why we make this podcast, which is that we can have control and do this the exact way that we want to. One of the wonderful things about making an audio drama or an audio or audio fiction is the cost to make it sound professional is so much lower than the cost to make a film look professional, where you have to pay for so much post production and all of that. But with your film, one of the things that always blows me away about your films, especially if in Infinity Pool and Possessor, you have these really incredible and original visual sequences. In Possessor, there's this moment where Voss dissolves into the body that she's possessing. Chris Abbott's body. And Infinity Pool, I'm thinking of the drug-fueled hallucinations. How do you figure out these complex visual languages and approach just creating that effect?
So it's a very collaborative, kind of hands-on process. Usually in my scripts now, I'll write sort of vague paragraph that says something like, there are flashes of nightmare imagery, the image deforms, it's a whatever, yada, yada, yada. And my team now sort of understands that's code for we're going to undertake this extremely long process of experimentation and figure out this sequence almost as a kind of experimental short film. And this is something I started with Kareem Hussein, my cinematographer, when we were developing Possessor. Possessor was in development for many, many years. I mean, it kept on nearly being financed and then falling apart. It would fall apart 4 times per year sometimes. It's an 8-year gap between my first film and my second film. And so Kareem and I spent a huge amount of time just messing with visual ideas we had. How can you, in a practical way, upset the usual image capturing process? How, shooting through gels with colored lights flaring off the gel, so you're getting a kind of color distortion, monochrome or monochrome with red with a kind of yellow thing. We had made a short film called Please Speak Continuously and Describe Your Experiences as They Come to You, which was a kind of it was a film in and of itself, but it was a way to start using those ideas in the context of an actual movie, because Possessor had fallen apart for whatever, the 30th time, and we were just eager to make something. So basically, it often starts with Kareem. The two of us will brainstorm ideas for how you can deform an image. Then we'll spend months and months just in his living room playing with projectors, with gels, with lighting, with any substances and weird lenses that we can put together, filters, and figure out how to create an image. And that sort of becomes eventually a bit of a camera effects palette. Like in Infinity Pool, we started playing with dichroic film and dichroic glass, and that dichroic film, depending on the angle that you look through it, it's a different color, and so that became key to that sort of rainbow colored effect that exists in a lot of those sequences.
So that's not like that's not a CGI effect that you put on afterward. It's not a filter. It's something
This is
that's
all
happening.
analog.
Oh yeah, there's not a frame of CGI in any of the sequences in
Wow.
Infinity Pool or Possessor. Or in the orgy, we had to paint out a bit of tape on the actors' bodies in 2 shots. Otherwise, it was totally practical.
Wait, what? Wait, I'm sorry. Excuse me? This was all practical?
Yeah. No. I mean, that's the sort of fun that we make for ourselves. So we built this storehouse of practical ideas. Then we brought on Dan Martin, who's our makeup effects artist, and so he once Dan's on, we're talking about puppets, we're talking about this sort of weird body stuff, this sort of pooing nipple and so on.
I hated the pooing nipple.
But like this is where, like, okay, so I said out loud, I hated that alone in my apartment.
Everyone hates it.
I loved it, but I was lucky enough I got to watch Infinity Pool. I got to watch like the extended unrated cut. I don't know what they called it, but the extended longer version. I got to watch it at Playhouse Cinema, which, by the way, when I rewatched Antiviral, and I noticed that you shot on like Sherman and Barton, one shot, or like there's like one shot where like Caleb Landry Jones is pulled out, and I don't know if you've been like to Playhouse in Hamilton, but it's like 2 minutes up the street from there is this now this like wonderful rep theater, and they played Infinity Pool. I got to see it. It was amazing. People were laughing at really uncomfortable moments, which is the best, like exactly what I was hoping, because I'd seen your other movies. I was very much hoping for that. But there's like the pooing nipple. There's like these seamless transitions from nipple, penis, vulva, breast. Like you've got like something that looks like a vulva and then something comes out of it. It looked like, and I was sitting there and I turned to my partner afterward and I was like, this reminded me so much of, do you remember in 2015, there was Deep Dream? This like Google thing. It was Google. You remember that, this Google AI thing, and it would find like you'd run like a video through it, and it would morph it and turn it into this hallucinogenic thing.
Everything's a dog. That kind of
everything's a dog and everything is eyes is really what it ended up being. Yeah, exactly. And I was just sitting there. I was like, did they use like? Is this like the first time I've ever seen someone use AI like responsibly to get a actual creative output? And now you're telling me that this was all just analog.
The opposite.
Oh yeah, it was just a really long, a really long process of analog fucking
That's
around.
incredible.
Um, Dan, well, I'm glad. I
No,
don't know
it's just like
if at the end at the end of the day, maybe it's just fun for ourselves. I hope
it
it has
should be.
it has its own sort of quality that like makes it worthwhile. But I think so. Okay, just to finish the thought. Dan builds the puppets. On Infinity Pool, we had Zosha Mackenzie, our production designer, who would build. She built like elaborate mirror boxes. We got really into different types of glass, and so, for instance, she built a mirror box that has a two-way mirror on the front, so you can shoot through it without seeing the camera reflected, and then smart glass on the back, so you could have this pinwheel of Titan tubes, like colored lights, where you would just see the lights floating there rather than the rig that's holding the lights, and so they would bounce around.
Mm-hmm.
Dan worked with a filmmaker, Lee Hardcastle, on stop motion, so they did some stop motion sequences in leads and then sent those to us. And then
Lee Hardcastle, he did Thingu, the Pingu thing.
yeah,
Yeah.
Lee, Lee Hardcastle.
Yeah.
We were very lucky to have him. We rephotograph, so we shoot all the stuff. We then shoot it through gels and stuff, and like we project it and then rephotograph it a million times so that we can cut through different layers. Like you have the same shot that is you're shooting it through one type of glass, distorting it one way, then you shoot it 6 more times in different forms of distortion, line those up and edit them so that they're synced so you can cut through different types of distortion. And then my editor, James Vandewater, on Infinity Pool, or Matt Hanna on Possessor, undertake these incredibly long and aggravating. I think. I mean, they're very polite about it, but it's a really long process of the two of us just sitting in a room being like, okay, what if you put this frame next? It's almost like stop motion, and there's a kind of alchemy, especially for Infinity Pool. You put 3 single frames together, and the order that you put them in really changes what image pops for you. And so there's a lot of just okay, we put this dancing person, weird penis puppet, and then like drop of colored water. What happens if you switch the order? And so it was just weeks and weeks of messing around.
Is this a philosophical decision? Is this like a budgetary consideration? Because it really does. You can see imagery kind of like this in a lot of movies, but you watch it in Possessor, you watch it in Infinity Pool, and there's something particularly upsetting about it. And I think that comes from the fact that it's real. Is this why you're doing it? Is this just sort of like an accidental benefit that comes from like, well, we can't afford a CG studio, so we're doing this mechanically? Where does this come from? Is it emergent? Is it by design?
So it's two things. One is I like the effect. I think you can't quite get the same thing out of CGI, and it's not that I think people shouldn't use CGI. It's not that I think CGI is inherently worse. It's just a different effect. You can't, like, this kind of analog stuff, this particular thing that we do, you can't. It's like so random and dependent on just the angle of the gel. And when it comes to the puppets, also there's a certain weight to them. That, as you say, I think a lot of people respond to, even if they don't consciously know why they're responding to it. If you have a CGI blade and CGI blood, that frees you up to do. I'm not saying you should never do that. It frees you up. If you're making John Wick and you want to have a really long one-er action sequence, you need to do that stuff because you can't have people running around with pumps and with prosthetics all over them. Like that's a filmmaking decision, but I think it has a different kind of weight to it that I like when it's practical. I think there's something to this effect that works for me. The other thing is it's a process question, because often, with Kareem, especially because we work so long together, we'll be trying something and then it won't work the way we thought it was going to work, and we'll stumble onto some other aesthetic thing accidentally, and that'll lead us down this path. And so having a hands-on process like that, where it's just Kareem and I fucking around for months and messing with stuff, it's just you stumble onto this really interesting stuff that then gets you excited, and then that starts to define the aesthetic of the film. If you're at least for me, I'm not a VFX artist, so doing it that way would be like saying, okay, I want an acid trip that has this. Can you sort of do something like that? And you're kind of removed from the process. Which again, it's not. I'm not saying that's the wrong way to do it, but for me, I really like all the happy accidents that come from actually just grabbing gels and messing around for all that time.
If it's VFX, it's coming from someone's preconceived idea of what that acid trip looks like, rather than being a reflection of something real in the world that you've created.
Yeah, it's almost too easy.
Well, it's definitely easier, and maybe this process is stupid. I don't know, but it's like in shooting through diopters, say, and gels, like, maybe I'm going to get too old for it soon, but Kareem and I would pull 18-hour days in his living room rephotographing this stuff, and the downside is that's mind-fuckingly long and crazy and horrible. The upside is some of the distortion is just my fingers in front of the glass wiggling, and so if I want, as I'm wiggling the glass and sticking my finger in front of it and the gel, and through the gel, the actor's face deforms in this way where I really like the image. Real time, I can just lean into that and explore that in a literally hands-on sense, and so it gives me more control, and I'm a control freak.
I mean, the other upside is like, do you like doing this?
Yeah, I mean,
there's the upside.
I think if we on a longer schedule, I would maybe like do it over several weekends instead of it's a bit of a crazy marathon, but yeah, it's deeply satisfying, and the process is obviously part of it. You need to enjoy what you're doing.
Yeah, like I mean, I think what I'm hearing, and I think is really interesting, is people talk a lot about the auteur filmmakers. They talk a lot about Scorsese, for example, and then the thing that is not as known is that most of the time when you think of an auteur, what you're really thinking of is a person who has surrounded themselves with a team that they go to work with every day. Like Scorsese was at like 50 years with Thelma Shoemaker. I might be saying her name wrong, but like his editor, he's been working with her since the 70s, I believe. And if that's what gets you up in the morning and excited to go to work in any job, in any career, I mean, that's like, everything is all in some ways the business of people, right? Like you want to work with who you want to work with. You want to spend your days with who you want to spend your days with. You want to wiggle your fingers in front of gels for 16 hours with your friend. That sounds great.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, film it's a deeply collaborative art form, and you can, people have different opinions about auteur theory. I think, it makes sense up to a point.
Yeah.
Sure, some filmmakers do sort of have this kind of like over the course of their career, you can say, okay, this person has a sort of recognizable voice. This other person is just doing whatever for each different film. But whether, in reality, you're working with these people and they're contributing their art in very significant ways. It's no, you can call a director an auteur, but they're not doing it themselves. I mean, they're doing it with these people who are contributing huge amounts of work and artistry to the film.
Moving from gels to the gel of human thought.
I like that.
I want to talk about class in your film, because I think that there's something really interesting going on where there's this genre of sort of like terrible things happening to rich people on vacation, like your Triangle of Sadness, your White Lotus, large parts of Succession, and Infinity Pool seems like it's going to fit into this genre, except the main character in Infinity Pool is not actually a rich person. He's like a barista who married into a rich family. I think there's a similar thing going on in Possessor, where it's about this kind of middle class woman who's sort of being groomed for entry into like the ownership class. Like Girder wants her to be the heir. And I think these are both interesting stories because there's stories about the ultra rich that are actually stories about people more like you and I, people who are sort of in the creative field, or people who are sort of upjumped actors and artists and baristas and petty cocaine dealers. And I want to ask about
There's nothing petty
how
about
you
cocaine dealing.
Well, is that a big cocaine deal?
He is a giant. He's a giant. He's a fucking giant. He says so himself. But yeah, like how do you tell a story about class without it turning into a sort of simple morality tale?
I guess it's a sort of a question of having a bunch of other stuff going on. I think my impulse towards those stories is less purely class-based and more about the fact that we tend to get caught up in these these significant currents that are completely beyond our control, and we get absorbed by them. And often those currents are defined by not just wealthy people, but say corporations, by these entities that really shape our world and therefore shape us and shape our thought and shape our behavior. And so I think, yeah, it's interesting because I've gotten a lot of questions about that doing press for Infinity Pool specifically, because it did come out at this time when a bunch of films and shows with that theme were really landing. You make there's such a lead up to such a long development period that I definitely wasn't intending to be part of this wave of shows and TV that were dealing with the same subject matter. It was just sort of a coincidence. I think people are responding to that stuff because the economy is fucked and everybody is worried about it, but also the stories are kind of perennial. Stories in film, I mean, class satire, you see it throughout the history of the medium and any storytelling media. But I think, with some of that stuff, I think it's just like Triangle of Sadness, nothing against it, but it's written with just that in mind. It's specifically about that. I think when I'm writing, it's less that I'm just trying to hammer home that one point, which I think other people are making just fine, and which I think is sort of self-evident. And it's more that is a fact of the world and the environment that is leading to these other kinds of mutations. And so much of Infinity Pool is about and mutations, I mean sort of psychological and social mutations. So much of Infinity Pool is also about just identity, what it is to be a single entity throughout time that is identical to yourself. It's about James's personal journey. It's about getting older and failing and personal vanity and all this stuff. So I think for me, it's maybe it's not something I'm doing deliberately, but it's I think in answer to your question, the way to do it is you make something that is about a bunch of different stuff in that context, rather than just trying to hammer home one point. Which, again, nothing wrong with. I don't think anything wrong with just trying to hammer home that one point. I just think it's sort of, to me, it's too self-evident to only want to make a story about that.
It's fun to make art that's about a bunch of things. And to me, like watching Infinity Pool, the thing that always that strikes me a lot about that film and all of your films is the relationship that the characters have to their work, and how their work relates to their identity, and how often, in watching Infinity Pool, the thing that I'm struck by the ending is that you have Skarsgård, this character that's essentially throughout the entire film and possibly throughout his entire life has always made the easiest choice available to him. And at the end of the film, he doesn't really have an identity, because the choices are like, there are no choices except to sit in the rain. Like, he's just sitting there. And like the way that I was, when I was talking to my partner, I had a pretty good quip, I thought. But I said, at the end of the movie, there's more of him than there's ever been because of and also less. Like there's, also nothing. And it's a really interesting way to, like watching Possessor and just being like, like you take it one day, you take a job, and then like 3 weeks later, you're like working at the murder factory. Like, it's just like you don't control the current controls you. And unless you're really willing to make the hard choices to get out, and are really willing to like take those hard looks at yourself, you just won't. you'll just like run back to comfort, like all the characters seemingly consistently do in your films.
For sure. And also it's only going to get worse. I mean, not to make this about AI suddenly, but
Yeah.
but it's very interesting because this is not an original point. This is something that a lot of people have been talking about more articulately than me for years now. But as we are online and are influenced by social media, there's this sense of the human being as being something that's hackable, are in totally insidious ways that we can feel that we can defend against because we're all so smart and self-aware, but none of us are self-aware enough because the Russian troll farm has made this Facebook persona that has influenced a family member of a close friend who's now adopted that belief. And now you're listening to them and you're thinking, hey, those ideas make a lot of sense. And so I think that's a valid concern. I'm not, I think AI is sort of amazing in some ways. I'm not against it across the board, but I do think a valid concern is that when you plug that into social media, the ability for this technology to learn you in a more complete and detailed and nuanced way, and therefore manipulate your own thoughts and therefore your own behavior is going to be amplified in this really extreme way. And so, I think maybe some of my anxiety that creeps into my films is just that we're living in that kind of world where it's hard to. I don't think will is ever totally self-generated. I think we're always reacting to things. I think our ideas, we're sort of claiming our ideas after they've been made, and ideas are kind of viral and values are kind of viral, and I think it's never that these things are pure and not influenced by our environment, but I think the ability to be sculpted in really nuanced ways by forces beyond our control is one of the things that's kind of defining our era right now.
Yeah, I think there's like this philosophical concept as well. I was reading this book by Mary Midgley called Wicked, where she talks about the idea, basically, why do people do bad things? And there's a sort of point that's made throughout the book in a few different areas, but it's the basic idea that, if you accept something a priori, or you claim something a priori about yourself, like, I can't be influenced, I'm too smart to be influenced, then you stop asking the question, am I being influenced? Am I being pushed into certain ideas? And once that happens, it's game over. Like, you will get grabbed by the deep fake video of Obama saying he's going to kill your kid. You will get like snaked up in that stuff. It's just going to happen.
Yeah, and that's, I think most of us have take that as a default position, even if we claim not to a certain degree, because it's just a function of the brain to sort of claim ownership over actions and thoughts. I don't think this is, not to get too abstract here, but I don't think there is this sort of coherent self, behind it all, that is just this sort of one coherent entity, and that's who we are in any kind of pure way. We're just a chorus of impulses and thoughts that are often conflicting and often come from outside of us. And
we're human relationships, and also relationships to machines, tools, things like that.
Yeah, we're sort of collective fictions in a way. We make ourselves up. we make ourselves up kind of after the fact. There's an actual sort of, apparently there's a sort of neuroscience basis to this. You act, and then your brain decides if you were the one responsible for that. And then if you are, it says, oh yeah, I did that. Which, when I was researching Possessor, there's all this really interesting stuff about the scientist, Dr. Jose Delgado, who in the 50s and 60s built these brain implants, these stimocevers, and it was sort of the Wild West for neuroscience. In the film, there's a shot of a bull being controlled by this guy in a bull ring. That's this famous experiment that the scientist did.
Oh, wow.
But the really interesting thing is, it was completely ethically dubious because he was using psychiatric patients, but he would implant implant this thing called a stimoceiver in their head. There would be a wire that would stimulate remotely a particular part of the brain. And what they found was when stimulating the motor cortex, they could control, say, open and close someone's hand, change their how open their iris is, that kind of thing. But the person would understand that it was being done to them. They would try to resist, and they wouldn't be able to resist opening and closing their hand. And there was some famous quote where the patient said, "Well, doctor, I see your electricity is stronger than my will." They would understand that they were being controlled physically. But put the wire in a different part of the brain. There was an experiment where every time the experimenter hit a button, the patient would get up, walk around their chair, and then sit back down. Every single time, it would just stimulate this part of the brain that would cause them to do that one series of movements. But every time they did it, they then made up a justification for why they had done it. They'd say, "Oh, I just heard a sound and I wanted to check it out. Oh, I was looking for my shoes." And so because of the particular point in the brain that they were stimulating, they were retroactively taking ownership of that action and saying, "Oh yeah, it was even it was ludicrous because they were doing the same thing over and over again. It was a different motivation each time, but they were just assuming that they had done it and making up after the fact a reason." And that's just how the brain works on a certain level. So that's why this kind of stuff is so effective, because you can implant an idea in someone and they will, by virtue of how their brain works, take ownership of it, and that will become who they are and what they think. It's fascinating but terrifying.
Chilling.
Yeah. Hate it. Absolutely hate it.
This is actually a good. Alexander, did you want to? You had a question about Ballard.
This episode is brought to you by Hyundai. Think you know what an electric vehicle should be? Think again. From the charge time and range in the Ioniq 5 and 6 to the 601 horsepower Ioniq 5N, Hyundai is redefining what EVs should be. Learn more about Hyundai EVs at HyundaiUSA.com. EPA estimated 303-mile driving range for 2024 Ioniq 5 SE SEL limited rear-wheel drive and 361-mile driving range for 2024 Ioniq 6 SE long-range rear-wheel drive with fully charged battery. Actual range may vary.
Yeah. So when Jacob first put me onto Infinity Pool is when we were both reading High Rise by Ballard. Right. And he was talking about how this movie felt so much like that. And you've talked in other interviews about how Ballard is a strong influence on your work. And yeah, this may be like a good segue into the sort of like mid-century science, sort of that same time period where he's working. A lot of his work is sort of fixated on this sort of like horrible MK Ultra science that the American government and private institutions are doing at that time. Like why do you think Ballard is such an important writer now, 60 years after his heyday?
I guess like any good science fiction writer, although obviously he didn't write just science fiction, he was just on to stuff that then became reality.
Everything.
I love High Rise. When I was writing Infinity Pool, I was reading a lot of the sort of later novels that he wrote. He wrote the series of novels, including Supercan and Cocaine Nights, and they all have this theme of a gated community, rich people in this sort of responsibility free, consequence free environment who are then going crazy and committing crimes. But Supercan, which I actually a producer I know got the rights, and I'm trying to make it into a limited series. Hopefully it'll happen. But that novel was written in I think 2000, 2001, or it came out in 2000, 2001, and it could not be more relevant right now. Like it completely predicted essentially tech company campuses, the conflict and immigration conflict in Europe, and this sort of new invasive culture of private companies taking over these areas and creating their own culture, populist politicians, and the sort of like fascist current that we're seeing now. It's all in that book, but 20 years before it fully exploded in a way that we're seeing now. So I think there's a timeless quality to his work as well, which is interesting. It's not dependent on a lot of dated technology. It's really about old human themes and just the way that we work and
psychology.
Yeah, exactly.
Alienation.
But he does then, there was maybe a particular focus on machinery that's a little bit less relevant now. The cars and planes still a thing, but maybe our concerns are more computer based now. But the psychology is still relevant, and the social studies in his work are still relevant.
Mm-hmm. There's now that you've mentioned that you're trying to adapt Supercan, is that the one?
Yeah,
Supercan. I just find it very interesting that obviously your father is a Ballard fan as well, did his own adaptation of Crash, and it kind of brings to mind, I think, a sort of funny image, which is, it's not really dinner time conversation, most of Ballard's work, but is this something that, did you grow up reading this stuff together? Like, did you come to it later?
Are these bedtime stories
yeah,
for
were these
you? Is this the Phantom Toll Booth?
Dr. Seuss.
Phantom Toll Booth, yes. I love the Phantom Toll Booth.
It's a great book.
That was one of my favorite books as a kid.
It's so good.
No, I mean, I came to him sort of later. I didn't really read Ballard until in my 20s, and then got really into his stuff. I mean, there's some authors who I guess my father was into, who I absorbed, like Philip K. Dick. I read Philip K. Dick all throughout my teens, and he's had a huge influence on me. And that was, my father gave me a copy of Ubik, and so it was sort of that kind of set me off. Ballard, I didn't come to later. I did meet him once. I wasn't, Crash was made when I was 14. I wasn't sad or doing anything. I met Ballard once years later, in London briefly, but I sort of stumbled into his writing a bit later on, actually.
Oh, it's very interesting, the way that, like, you sort of build up influences over time. Like, it's interesting to hear, like, Philip K. Dick to Ballard, because I feel like Philip K. Dick is a really interesting author because he's a very aware person of certain things, and then also very unaware in a lot of other ways. And then I feel like the things that he's unaware of are the things that Ballard is really aware of.
Right.
You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. I also, we wanted to ask about just Antiviral and Infinity Pool, and I would even say Possessor at times. They're just, like, very funny films. Mm-hmm. What's the relationship that you see between comedy and horror, and or just your approach to comedy?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that question. They are definitely intended to be funny, although not everybody agrees. I remember a journalist almost getting into a physical fight with me on the Antiviral press tour, where maybe an exaggeration, but I was insisting that it was a comedy, and he was so mad at me for trying to say it was a comedy, because I guess he was, like, disturbed by it, and he was like, it's not funny. I was like, all right.
It's pretty funny.
It's very funny.
I don't know.
Possessor, I'll say, that feels more like a tragedy to me. That feels like a very, like, I saw Possessor and I thought, okay, here's like comedy, tragedy, comedy. He's doing the Coen brothers thing. But do you see Possessor as a comedy?
Still meant to be somewhat funny, I think. I mean, not Infinity Pool more so, probably. With Infinity Pool, I was really worried when we were editing it, because it was intended to be obviously funny. We all thought the script worked as as a kind of comedy. When you're editing, at a certain point, you're showing the film to friends and colleagues and trying to, people who haven't read the script. You have screenings throughout the tail end of the editing process, because the stuff you can't see anymore. The stuff you don't know if something's working, because you know the script too well. You have to show it to people. But no one laughed at all. The only thing that got laughs for some reason was the urns, and the urns, like, we didn't think the urns were that.
It's a very funny moment.
I was like, okay, the urns, like, it's okay. It's a bit of an easy joke, but the urns actually were kind of killing in that context, but nothing else, not a hint of laughter throughout the whole film. And I was just like, we're fucked. Like, because if people don't think this is funny, we're in such trouble.
Were you ever tempted to put for the final scene where he's sitting in the rain. Were you ever tempted to put the Curb Your Enthusiasm music over that?
Yeah, I mean, maybe that would have been the way out. I wish I'd thought of that.
Or the Seinfeld
Next
bass.
film.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anything, Larry David inspired for sure. But yeah, at Sundance though, we at the premiere got laughs at the right spot. So early in that screening, I was like, okay, like who knows how this film will do, but people are laughing at it, so we're safe.
I think the other thing is like it's also a funny film, but that doesn't mean that you need to laugh at certain like I think in the same way that the dread builds, there are moments where the comedy builds, and if you think about big laugh moments as sort of the jump scares of the comedy world, I still feel like this is a very I was like laughing like nervously at certain points, but I was just sitting there just like, that's a really funny scene. Like that's like I was just enjoying the ride.
Where she's like chasing him down the road on the hood of a car,
yeah,
yelling at him. Or like, when he's strangling himself to death and you're just like, buddy, how did you come to this? How'd you let this happen?
Leave.
Come on.
That's also an interesting thing just about the class question. When I was looking up just ages ago, I was just thinking about this with Infinity Pool. I looked up, interviews to see and reviews to see people talking about it. And people were really trying to shoehorn this into the like Triangle of Sadness mold by mentioning that Skarsgård's character was a once popular novelist, and like the film explicitly in text, he was not popular. The book that he wrote did not do well. And it's interesting that like, I don't know if it was intentional on their part or if it like on the part of the journalist or the reviewers. But it was just a very interesting, to your point about, are people being controlled by the currents, or do they have their own willpower? They're just getting swept along in this idea. It's like, well, he must have been popular. This must be a movie that's part of this thing. It's like, no, it's not.
Right.
It's just, it's interesting to, just that moment where Mia, like, it's one of the biggest moments in the film, Mia Goth on the hood of the car talking about how his book sucked. and then it's like they've removed it from their brain when they're writing the review or writing the introduction to an interview. It's surprising in that way.
Yeah, it's very, I mean, I won't rag on reviewers too much.
No.
Yeah. But a lot of them are watching the film comes out at a film festival. They're watching it as one of 6 films that they watched that day. They're like racing to get the review out the next day. I don't know. I mean, some of them I've had reviews or interviews where you're just like, you're fully inventing things, and I can't tell how much this is malicious or how much this is just, it's probably not malicious, but it's
AI generated.
It's at least careless about the fact. Well, no, truly. I mean, there's this new thing where if journalists are interviewing you, some of them have AIs that join them in the chat room, and they're transcribing your interview, but they don't do it very well. And sometimes you read the article afterwards, and you're like, I know I'm an awkward interview, but like I swear I'm not that bad. Like it's just like a series of sentences that make literally no grammatical sense, and it's you can sometimes see, okay, it for sure misheard that word that would have been the actual word. So I don't know. I don't know why I'm rambling about that.
No, it's weird. It's like there's this assumption that AI is better than it is, and then people are using it. It's like it's a tool. It's like a hammer. You can use a hammer to hammer a nail. You can also use it to kill your best friend. Like AI is the same.
Or
like
yourself.
Or yourself.
Or
I mean,
your
that's a tough one.
Clone.
Yeah. Or your biological clone.
I want to ask, for me, all of your films feel very Canadian. Like, Possessor, extremely filmed in Toronto and Hamilton. Like the suburb where Voss lives looks eerily like the place where my parents live in the suburbs of Toronto. Infinity Pool, a lot of these rich people have accents that sound to me like very upper Canadian, posh accents. Is there like a particularly Canadian spiritual disease that you think you're exploring in your movies? Because I think there's like a different type of shitty rich person that is a Canadian shitty rich person to an American shitty rich person. And I think your movies kind of like get at something there. And I'd love it if you just sort of give me a little freewheeling conversation about Canada's spiritual illness.
Well, But the most shocking review Infinity Pool got was, I think, the CBC reviewer. I forget what the title was, but it said, it's Infinity Pool is this, and this, sort of complimenting it, and also brackets, unfortunately Canadian. And the review the review seemed to be saying it's just, this could have been a fun movie with no thought behind it, but we as Canadians have this thing where we feel like we have to insert ideas into films, and therefore that's horrible, and this is like an otherwise
You hate to have ideas.
movie. And I'm just like, this is the CBC. You're saying that, like, unfortunately, this movie is too Canadian because it has some like ideas in there. And I was like, that's that we all wanted to get unfortunately Canadian T-shirts after that review came out. It was like it was kind of shocking. That's not an answer to your question. I just had to vent. I feel like there's.
I appreciate that. That is holy wow.
A good production company
and I was
name.
showing it to Neon because I was in the US at the time, and they were like, "Whoa, what is wrong with your country?" I was like, "Yeah, it's this self-loathing like." You can bend over backwards to find a way to label something Canadian so that you can hate it. I don't know how that fits into the answer to your question. I think, it's not something I'm doing consciously, but I am absorbing dialogue from, people I've met and, people on television. And I don't know, you're such a product of your environment. And so often your characters are amalgamations of people people you heard talking in a cafe. Like, sometimes it's just fascinating. You go to a cafe to work and you just cannot believe the human being yelling about something in front of you, and that just gets into your head, and suddenly it becomes one scene with a character or something like that. So yeah, I don't know. I don't spend a lot of time in the US, to be honest, so it's hard for me to have a great perspective on Canadian rich versus US rich, but I think it's more through osmosis than a calculated attack on the Canadian rich specifically.
I get the impression that a lot of these rich people who are doing murder tourism in the former Soviet Union are like Liberal Party voters. Like, they're people who are sort of think of themselves as being on the right side of history, kind of like progressive and all this. Which feels very Canadian to me. Right.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, we have our own, but we have a look at our province. I mean, we have a very right-wing conservative side of Canada that weirdly absorbed. I remember the marches in Toronto during the pandemic. There were people carrying Trump flags and signs that fuck Biden, and I'm just like, what? What? Who are you? Like, but it's just, we absorb that kind of American culture. It's sort of, talk about self-hating Canadians. I think that sort of displaces our own culture, because this kind of, whatever the cultural weight equivalent is of celebrity, it's like you're exposed to it over and over again. And suddenly, your real problem is Joe Biden, Yeah. But those people exist here, and that's, we're not better than that, certainly.
No, it's a cultural hegemony kind of thing, and I think you end up in this interesting space where there's this assumption that American problems and American issues are also Canadian issues and Canadian problems and Canadian themes as well. And if you look at Canada, I think something that's interesting here is, and we've talked about this in a few episodes of Wrong Station, but the idea that, Canada kind of thinks of itself as a place to be strip mined, and like all of the resources and value needs to be extracted from this land and from the people. And I feel like in Canada, even left-wing liberal-minded people are very aggressively like anti-art in a way that I think is really surprising. And what you end up with is really like a non-existent sort of artist class, or a very small condensed artist class in Canada, where you have people like yourself or writers who are just like successful people who make art, who exist off their art and produce things that entertain thousands upon thousands of people. And that value is just kind of denigrated in Canada in a way that it is not in the United States. And maybe that's because you know, in the United States, you have a lot of people who are extremely wealthy who do represent a part of that cultural current towards valuing the arts. But it doesn't really feel like it exists in Canada. In Canada, I mean, this is the thing that I really get from your movies. Canada just feels like a bunch of corporations, but none of them are. But none of them are artistic. None of them are interested in the art even a little bit, and none of the people in those corporations are interested in the arts, except as a property to be like strip mined. Like Antiviral is like the best example of it, where you've got like all of these people who are celebrities. You never know what any of them do, which I think is a great little detail. But you got people buying like steaks made of their, you know, their cloned flesh, or buying diseases that they had. And it's like even their bodies are not safe from being strip mined in that way.
Sure. I mean, the Canadian art scene is weird because we don't, you know, we hate Canadian artists in a way, or we devalue them. I mean, you know, again, Canadian film is seen as a way of insulting a film.
Yeah.
That's a kind of long-standing tradition. In any Canadian artistic field, it's like no one will pay any attention to you here unless you make it somewhere else, and then you know, if you make it in the US, suddenly you're embraced as a kind of Canadian hero or whatever. We're very suspicious of our own art scene and our own culture in general, and I don't know where that comes from. I don't know if it's an inferiority complex. I don't know if it's just how we're sort of not very critical about our own stuff. We just sort of, I used to hang out with a bunch of stand-up comedians, and
name names.
No. I don't even know if any of them are still. It was quite a while ago. I don't know if any of them are still doing it, but you know, they would on a regular basis engage in this masochistic process of going up in a bar and just one by one performing their sets to people who were not listening to them at all and not engaging with them at all, and not, you know, and some
Feels
of them
very familiar.
Yep, I've been there.
But, yeah, maybe you've had this experience. Yes. But there's this, yeah, I do think there's a kind of Canadian impulse that's just like, okay, you've done it, good for you, I guess. You've showed, but we're not hypercritical of each other's work, so we're not really pushing each other to be better in a way which makes it very comfortable because we're not being attacked. But
you
at the same
can't be
time,
mean, but you certainly can't be nice.
Yeah, you can't be mean or nice, and so it's sort of, you know, it's an environment where it's hard for people to get passionate, I think, about art, because you're not tearing anyone down, but you're not really paying attention to them. It's just sort of happening. It's like technically a thing that we do, and like, you know, thanks for showing up, kind of like that. That's sort of our attitude towards Canadian artists. Whereas if, you know, I went to the Edinburgh Fringe Festival many years ago, and it's like, if you are not doing a good job as a stand-up comedian, someone is going to throw a full beer at your head. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's not, if you have the gall to get up on stage and try and do comedy, like, you have to be so good, or they're going to completely eviscerate you, maybe literally. And you know, that there are advantages and disadvantages to both approaches, but I think the disadvantage is that we kind of are pretty apathetic about our own art scene.
I don't want to keep you too much longer. We have like 2 more questions.
Sure.
And you've already been like more than generous than with your time. Like, this is, you've been on with us for almost like 50 minutes now. I'm going to cut this out, by the way. Don't worry. But
I have been generous.
I'm a giant.
Don't cut out this table flip.
So we also had a question from our previous interview, Trevor Henderson, the artist, monster artist. And, you know, he wanted to ask, he said, I'm sure you get questions about, you know, David Cronenberg's career all the time, but like, setting that aside, what's your relationship to body horror, which is a theme that does come up in your work, and, you know, how do you use it to get at the themes that you're interested in? And it's really, I want to add something to that question, because it's really interesting the way you talk about manipulating images, but you're manipulating it like either within the camera or within the way that image is being shown, which I do feel is different from, you know, the way that body horror is usually done, where it's usually a lot of prosthetics. It's usually a lot of like, you know, very intense or realistic like malformations on a thing that is, you know, center stage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I normally avoid talking about my father's work because it ends up ends up being the whole article. But since this is a podcast, I'll just I'll let it slide.
Well, I honestly, I'm not even interested in you talking about that. I want to hear your relationship. And that was Trevor's thing too. Yeah.
But there's something. No, it's cool. I'm just being a dick. Well, no, because the thing is, he obviously essentially invented the genre, and one of the things about his filmmaking style is it's very much about not feeling the camera. There are no zooms, for instance, in his films, and when he's doing hallucination stuff, it's not about manipulating the quality of the image. It's really about what's going on in front of the camera. And I think with body horror, that sort of set the tone for body. It's very much about puppets with skin flowing into skin and that kind of stuff, which I like, but it's not it's playing with the content rather than the form, and then that's sort of the tradition there. And that's kind of, I know his approach and what he, established as that kind of, that part of the genre. It's interesting. I know there are sort of body horror beats in my films. I feel like people are maybe a bit quick to classify them as body horror because of my name. I don't feel like it's not totally unjustified. There is sort of body manipulation stuff in the films, but it's less specifically the focus. I mean, I think my interest in it is probably similar to the pleasure of that genre, or why that stuff is effective, is because we have these relationships with our bodies, and those are central to our experiences as human beings. That's regardless of whether you want to be a kind of physicalist, you are your body kind of person, or whether there's some kind of duality that you see there with a body and mind. Still, we're dealing with our bodies every day, and we're dealing with our bodies aging, and we're dealing with the good things and the bad things. And so, filmmaking, like most narrative art forms, when it's narrative, is about, in some way, what it is to be a human being, and what it is to have a human experience. So much of that is our body, and so the body turning against us is an easy but effective form of horror and a way to explore horror. I think in my stuff, it's like, there's less of a focus specifically on that kind of body horror, and it's like Voss having a penis during sex. It's really, her relationship with her body, experiencing this other body.
These things are downstream from the dissolution of identity.
Yeah, exactly. It's when you make something unfamiliar out of something familiar, suddenly you look at it with a different perspective. Oh yeah, what is it to have sex in your body? It's something we might not examine really all the time, but in a film, if you just sort of skew it in a certain way, and you're like, what, imagine you're in somebody else's body having sex, what would you, how, suddenly you can talk about sexuality in your own body, or in people's relationships with their bodies and sex. And so to me, I guess that's the impulse towards that kind of stuff.
So it's like a tool to get at the ideas about identity and ideas about how we interact and how our relationships are formed, like within ourselves. Like I when you mentioned this thing about there being very few body horror beats, I started thinking through it, and I was like, oh yeah, there's only like two things that I would directly classify as body horror in your films. And I think it's, that final scene in Antiviral, which is a great scene, and one of the both like just like one of those perfect, super funny and super like gross, horrifying moments where like I was just sitting there and just like, don't drink the blood, Caleb. don't do it. I know you want
buddy,
to, but don't
drink
do
the
it.
blood.
Don't drink the blood off
that blood.
Making
you drink this blood.
The day that we shot that was the day that I met Caleb's dad. Like Caleb's dad, he's from Caleb's from Texas, and his dad is like a very large man with a huge beard and a cowboy hat. And he came to set, and he's just towering over me as this massive guy, and I don't know him. And then I'm just like, oh shit.
Son, you making my boy drink blood?
Well, but
well,
also,
Caleb, if you gonna make him drink blood, you better make sure he does it real sexual like.
well, Caleb, he's dropping to his knees and sucking on it, and I have to be like, Caleb, suck the flesh tube harder. Like you've got it. And his dad's there, and I thought he was gonna kill me, and then but his dad's really nice and like a really funny guy. And he just sort of turned to me and was like, "You have quite the imagination."
Oh my god, that is the. I'm glad that he was there to see that happen. I also this takes us back. I wanted to bring
Every
something
father
up
for every son should have that moment.
Yeah, you need to make a movie for every father and every son. So that's a lot of movies, but you got to do it. But this brings me. I wanted to mention something to you because I thought you would at least enjoy this little bit of our shared history. So I first interviewed Brandon. I first interviewed you like 11 years ago after Antiviral came out. I saw it. I was like, this is great. And I asked you to come to this club that I ran at U of T, and it was like a club for a student club. And it was just like, come and give a talk. And there were a few people, and we were just like chatting about like, I think we were talking like, I remember talking about like Yorgos Lanthimos, and you were talking about how at one point on Antiviral there was, it was really tough shoot, and then one day you guys all got to like smear blood on the walls, and that was like the best day of filming. But I wanted to tell you this: that club did not exist. That was just me. I formed a club that was just me, and then I gave it a fancy sounding name, and I used that to get people to come in and talk to me about art that they were making so that I could learn things. And then I would send out like a call, and I was like really happy that you came, and I was like, fuck, now I got to get like an audience. And then I like just like went and like sent out a message to people like, come to this event.
Okay, but is this a real podcast? I mean, that's a great name,
it remains to be seen.
Is any podcast a real podcast?
That's actually certainly not a Canadian one. But I wanted to share that with you because I thought you would enjoy hearing that I tricked you 12 years ago, and now we're having a real conversation for real people.
I appreciate your honesty and your guile. That's
It worked surprisingly well. I tricked like 12 people. I got Colin Mockery.
That's amazing.
Yeah, thank you.
Well done.
Thanks. So we're at the end. I'd love to hear if you've got anything to plug. If anyone out there is listening who controls is a production company or a distribution hub, make Supercan, please. But other than that, what are you up to?
Yeah, not a huge amount. Yeah, Supercan again. We're working on that. I have a space horror film called Dragon that I'm working on as well. But it's also
hell yeah.
Neither of those things are locked in. I really hope I'm going to make them. Yeah, sadly, not a huge amount to plug. If you happen to be in the U.S., we just put out the uncut Infinity Pool.
Is that the one that I saw?
That's the one. That would have been the one that you saw too.
Go see it. It kicks ass. It's so good.
It fucks.
It fucks. It fucks. It stabs. It does all sorts of things.
It fucks. It sucks. It does all the things.
Yeah, but it's also a particularly good theater watch. And I will say that. That was probably the best movie I've seen in theaters this year, and I saw Miyazaki, so that's good stuff.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, I think that's everything. Thank you so much for your time, and just like that. It was really nice talking to you again after a dozen years, and
thanks
excited to.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Yeah. That's great.